I never imagined that love could vanish so quickly, leaving nothing but silence and shame in its place. My name is Margaret Holloway, and for most of my life I believed I was building a family anchored in loyalty. I stood by my husband, Charles, through his restless dreams and endless promises. Together we raised 2 beautiful daughters, Amara, just 11, and little Naomi, only 8. But one morning, he was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Only a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table with words that cut deeper than any knife. You'll figure it out. Figure it out. Those words haunted me as I looked around at the mountain of unpaid bills, the empty cupboards, and the 2 pairs of innocent eyes staring back at me. I had nothing but my will to keep breathing and their fragile trust resting in my hands. That day, the life I knew turned to ashes. My neighbors whispered, my family avoided me, and debt collectors circled like vultures. I carried the weight of disgrace on my shoulders. Nights felt endless. Sometimes I cried until dawn, afraid my girls might hear. But somewhere in that darkness, something inside me refused to die. I wasn't just a woman abandoned. I was a mother, and mothers don't surrender. I promised myself that I would rise from the ruins, no matter how long it took, no matter how much it hurt. This is the story of how I was left with 2 daughters and a mountain of debt, and how, against every odd, I rose from the ashes. I still remember that first week after Charles left, as if it were branded into my skin. Every corner of the house carried his absence. The closet with his empty hangers, the dent in the couch where he used to sit, the smell of his cologne fading into nothing. For days I half expected to hear his footsteps at the door, but only silence answered me. The silence wasn't the hardest part. It was the letters. Brown envelopes kept sliding under the door, one after another, each demanding more money than I had ever seen in my life. The rent, the utilities, the credit cards, all in my name. Charles hadn't just walked out. He had buried me under debt before slamming the door shut. I tried to hide the panic from my girls. Amara, with her quick eyes, sensed it anyway. She sat beside me at the kitchen table one evening and whispered, "Mama, are we going to be okay?" I wanted to tell her yes, to wrap her in promises as warm as a blanket. But my throat burned with the truth I couldn't say. Naomi, too young to understand, only tugged at my sleeve, asking when Daddy was coming home. My heart split open in that moment, but I smiled and told them stories about hope I barely believed in myself. The whispers in the neighborhood started quickly. Women at the market shook their heads, pity thinly veiled behind judgment. Men smirked as if my downfall confirmed some cruel prediction. "She'll never make it on her own," I overheard one say. Every word felt like a nail hammered into my pride. At night, when the girls were asleep, I sat by the window with the bills spread out on the table. My hands trembled as I added numbers that never added up. Shame washed over me in waves, but beneath it, something stronger began to stir. Anger. Not just at Charles, but at a world so quick to declare me finished. I told myself, if the world wanted me broken, I would rise instead. Even if it meant crawling through fire, even if it meant bleeding for every inch forward, I would not let my daughters see me defeated. And so, with nothing but exhaustion in my bones and defiance in my chest, I took my first step into a life I never asked for, but one I was determined to survive. Children have a way of sensing the truth, even when you bury it under smiles. Amara was only 11, but her eyes carried questions I wasn't ready to answer. She watched me count coins late at night, whispering prayers I didn't know I still believed in. Naomi, still a child, carried her innocence like a lantern in the dark. She would curl up in my lap and ask, "Mama, when is Daddy coming back?" Each time my chest tightened, and I forced a smile I didn't feel. I decided early that I would not let my daughters see the weight of the world crushing me. I skipped meals so they could eat, telling them I wasn't hungry. I mended old dresses and polished second-hand shoes until they looked almost new. I braided Naomi's hair before school, even on mornings when my hands shook from exhaustion. Every detail became a shield, hiding the chaos I carried inside. But the silence was heavy. Silence at the dinner table, when his chair sat empty. Silence in the evenings, when the bills stacked higher than the plates. Silence in my prayers, when I begged for strength but heard nothing back. It was as though the house itself had swallowed my screams and replaced them with emptiness. One evening, Amara broke that silence. She placed her small hand over mine and whispered, "Mama, we don't need him. We just need you." Her words pierced me deeper than any insult from a neighbor. For the first time since Charles left, I let the tears come, not hidden behind a locked door, but right there in front of my child. And instead of breaking me, it bound us together. I realized then that silence didn't have to mean defeat. It could also mean resilience, our quiet defiance against a world waiting for us to crumble. So I carried that silence like armor. Every day I rose before the sun, my body weak, but my will unbroken. My daughters wouldn't inherit despair. If I had to claw my way through every shadow, I would. Because I wasn't just surviving for myself anymore, I was surviving for them. The first real blow came on a Wednesday morning. I had just sent Amara and Naomi off to school with peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. I stood at the window, watching them walk away, when I heard the grinding of an engine outside. A tow truck idled in front of my house, the driver stepping out with a clipboard in one hand and a hook in the other. He didn't even look at me when he said, "Ma'am, the bank sent me." Within minutes, the only car I had was chained and lifted into the air. I begged him, my voice trembling, "Please, I need it for work, for my children." But he only shrugged, repeating, "Not my call." And there in the street, as neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, I felt my dignity stripped away. By the time the girls came home, the driveway was empty. Amara froze at the sight and whispered, "Mama, where's the car?" I couldn't answer. Naomi started crying, asking how we would visit Grandma now. I gathered them both in my arms, but inside, shame devoured me. That night, when the house was dark, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the eviction notice, the empty wallet, and the echoes of the tow truck still in my ears. My pride cracked and I broke down, head buried in my hands. But in the middle of that storm of despair, something shifted. I thought about the words I overheard at the market. "She'll never survive without a man." The sting of those words fueled a fire in me. I decided then that no one, not Charles, not the bank, not the gossips, would write my ending. If the world wanted me humiliated, I would rise louder than their whispers. If they wanted me weak, I would grow stronger. That night, I stopped waiting for miracles. I knew survival would not come from prayers alone. It would come from my hands, my back, and my will. The cruel awakening had burned me, yes. But like steel in the forge, I felt myself hardening, and I swore my daughters would never again see me on my knees. The next morning, I woke before the sun. My body ached from sleepless nights, but my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. I couldn't wait for kindness or charity. I had to move. I walked miles to the nearest diner and asked the manager if he needed help. He looked me over, then handed me an apron. "You can start with dishes," he said. The pay was low, the hours endless, and my hands cracked from the hot water, but I thanked God for that apron. It was the first lifeline I had touched since Charles left. When that wasn't enough, I scrubbed floors in office buildings at night. I ironed clothes for neighbors. I even sold baked goods at church on Sundays, smiling through exhaustion. Some nights I crawled into bed with blisters on my feet, but my daughters never went to sleep hungry. That was all that mattered. Amara, wise beyond her years, began helping in ways that broke my heart and made me proud all at once. She started packing extra sandwiches to sell at school. Naomi, with her tiny hands, would fold napkins while humming softly to herself. They didn't complain, they didn't cry. They carried their part of the load with quiet courage. One evening, after a 14-hour day, I came home to find a small jar on the kitchen counter. Inside were coins the girls had saved from selling those sandwiches. A note rested beside it in Amara's careful handwriting. "For the bills, Mama. We're in this together." I sat down at that table and wept, not from despair this time, but from the fierce love burning inside me. My daughters weren't just surviving beside me. They were fighting with me. And together, brick by brick, we were building a way out of the ruins. Every dollar earned was a step forward. Every meal on the table was a victory. I was no longer a woman abandoned. I was a mother rising. Years passed, and little by little the sharp edges of survival dulled into routine. I worked, I saved, I kept moving. The scars of those early years never fully faded, but they hardened me into something Charles would never have recognized. Then one afternoon at the market I heard his name. Two women stood by the fruit stand, their voices low but eager. "Did you hear about Charles Holloway?" one whispered. "Left high and dry by that woman he ran off with. Word is he's broke, nothing but a shadow now." I froze where I stood, my hand tightening around the basket. For a moment I wasn't in that market. I was back in the kitchen, staring at that folded note. "You'll figure it out." Rage and bitterness surged like a storm, drowning the air in my lungs. Neighbors carried the gossip like wildfire, each detail cut differently. How the woman he left me for drained him of every penny, how he drifted from town to town, how he looked thinner, older, forgotten. Some even laughed about it, calling it justice. But justice wasn't what I felt. What I felt was betrayal echoing through the years, fresh as the day he walked away. That night, I pulled out the only photograph I had left of him, the one I'd hidden at the bottom of a drawer. In it he was young, smiling, arm draped around me like we were unbreakable. I stared at that smile until it turned to ashes in my mind. Then, with steady hands, I carried the picture to the sink, struck a match, and watched it burn. Flames licked the edges, curling his face into smoke. The smell of scorched paper filled the kitchen, and with it came a strange, quiet release. For the first time, I realized I didn't need to chase the man who broke me, or the justice others thought I deserved. My life was no longer defined by his betrayal. My daughters were thriving, and I was still standing, stronger, harder, free. But in the silence that followed, a voice inside me whispered, "This story isn't over. One day he'll return. And when he does, he'll find a woman he cannot break. Opportunity doesn't always come dressed in gold. Sometimes it wears plain shoes and knocks softly when you least expect it. For me, it came through a woman named Evelyn Whitaker. I had taken on a small housekeeping job in Charleston, scrubbing floors in a grand old house owned by a wealthy widow. Evelyn was sharp, with silver hair pinned neatly and eyes that missed nothing. She wasn't unkind, but she carried herself with the air of someone who'd seen the world chew people up and spit them out. One afternoon, after I'd finished polishing her dining room, she called me into the kitchen. On the counter sat a tray of sweet potato pies I had baked the night before for extra income. My girls had wrapped them carefully in foil, and I had brought one to share with Evelyn as a gesture of thanks. She cut a slice, tasted it, and for the first time since I met her, a genuine smile softened her face. "Margaret," she said slowly, "this is better than anything my caterer has served in years." I laughed nervously, thinking she was being polite. But Evelyn wasn't a woman who wasted words. She leaned closer. "Have you ever thought about selling your cooking beyond bake sales and church events? You have a gift." Her words struck me like a match in the dark. I had always cooked out of necessity, stretching ingredients to feed my girls, seasoning food with love when money was scarce. But the idea that my recipes could be more than survival, that they could be a door opening, it shook something deep inside me. Weeks later, Evelyn invited me to assist at one of her gatherings. She let me prepare a few dishes alongside her regular staff. I watched as guests returned for second helpings, praising flavors that reminded them of childhood, of home. My hands trembled as I served, not from fear this time, but from the possibility that my life might not always be defined by struggle. That night, as I tucked Amara and Naomi into bed, I told them, "Something is changing. I don't know where it leads, but I can feel it." Their eyes widened with hope, a mirror of my own. A spark had been lit, and though I didn't yet know it, that spark was the beginning of a fire that would rebuild everything I had lost. The spark Evelyn lit quickly grew into a flame I couldn't ignore. With her encouragement, I started taking on small orders: pies for church gatherings, trays of cornbread for community events, fried chicken for family reunions. Word traveled faster than I ever imagined. People didn't just eat my food, they remembered it. They asked for my name again and again until it started to mean something beyond struggle. I scraped together what I could and bought a second-hand stove from a restaurant that was closing. My girls helped me turn our tiny kitchen into a workshop of hope. Amara chopped vegetables with steady hands, and Naomi, always eager, wrapped silverware in napkins, humming as she worked. We laughed, we sweated, and for the first time in years, our house smelled not of worry, but of ambition. Before long, I was cooking for weddings, church anniversaries, and company banquets. My recipes, fried catfish, collard greens, peach cobbler, became whispers on people's lips across Charleston. And then came the day Evelyn placed her hand on mine and said, "You need a name for this. People should know who's behind these meals." That's how Holloway Catering was born. I carried the name of the man who abandoned me, not as a burden, but as a trophy. Every plate, every dish, every satisfied smile was proof that I had taken his betrayal and turned it into legacy. The first time I signed a catering contract under that name, my hand trembled. But when I looked across the table and saw my daughters watching me with pride, I knew it wasn't just about food anymore. It was about dignity, about reclaiming everything that had been stripped from me. Within 5 years, we weren't just surviving, we were thriving. Holloway Catering became known throughout South Carolina. People booked us months in advance. My girls grew alongside the business, no longer children of abandonment, but daughters of a woman who had built something out of nothing. And yet, even in the glow of success, a shadow lingered. Deep down, I knew the past wasn't finished with me. Charles was still out there somewhere, and fate has a way of dragging ghosts back into the light when you least expect them. It happened on a night that should have been one of my proudest. I was overseeing a charity gala in downtown Charleston, a grand event with chandeliers glittering and music floating through the air. Holloway Catering had been chosen to serve, and every dish bore the mark of years of sacrifice and resilience. I was in the kitchen, adjusting trays of roasted chicken and sweet potato soufflé, when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in nearly a decade. "Margaret!" The air left my lungs. I turned, and there he was, Charles. But he wasn't the man who once walked out the door. The proud shoulders were stooped, the sharp suit replaced by worn, fraying clothes. His skin was weathered, his eyes bloodshot, his face a map of regret. He looked older than his years, beaten down by the same world that had once left me in ruins. "Maggie," he stammered, stepping closer. I need you." For a moment, my body betrayed me. Memories rushed in like a flood. The note on the table, the car being hauled away, the nights of hunger and humiliation. My hands gripped the counter to steady myself. Behind me, my daughters, no longer children but young women, stood frozen. Amara's eyes widened with recognition. Naomi's lips parted in shock. They had lived their whole lives without him, yet here he was, a ghost suddenly demanding space in our reality. Charles's voice cracked as he reached for me. I've got nothing left. No money, no home, no one. Please, help me. In that moment I saw not the husband I once loved, but the man who had chosen to abandon us. His desperation was raw, his humiliation complete. And though a part of me had once longed for this reckoning, standing there in my chef's whites with my daughters by my side, I realized something. He wasn't my story anymore. The past had finally caught up with him, and I was no longer the woman he left behind. Charles stood there trembling, his hands outstretched, eyes wet with shame. For a moment I saw the man I once married, the one who whispered promises in the dark, who held our daughters when they were newborns. But then I remembered the note, the debts, the nights of hunger, and the whispers of neighbors saying I would never survive without him. I straightened my shoulders, meeting his gaze without flinching. You left me with 2 hungry girls and a mountain of debt, I said, my voice steady, sharp as glass. You told me to figure it out. Do you remember? His lips quivered, but no sound came. He lowered his eyes like a child caught in a lie. Well, Charles, I continued, my daughters silent at my side, I did figure it out, without you. And look at me now. I gestured to the kitchen bustling behind me, to the trays of food carrying my name, to the daughters who had grown strong in his absence. He took a step closer, his voice breaking. Maggie, please. I'm starving. I got nowhere else to go. A bitter laugh rose in my throat, one I hadn't known I carried. Starving? Now you know how it feels. That was me, Charles. That was your daughters. We begged in silence while you built a new life somewhere else. Amara's jaw tightened, and Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but not for him, for me. They had waited years for this moment too. Charles sank to his knees, his hands trembling, his face crumbling into despair. He whispered, "Just give me a chance." But I felt nothing. No pity, no longing, no love, only clarity. He was no longer the man who defined my story. He was the consequence of his own choices. I leaned down just enough for him to hear and whispered, "You are a stranger at my door. Nothing more." Then I turned my back on him. The final rejection, delivered not with rage, but with the power of a woman who had already won. Charles knelt on the floor, shoulders shaking, his voice cracked and small. For years I had dreamed of this moment, of seeing him broken, begging, stripped of the arrogance with which he once walked away. But standing there, I realized revenge wasn't fire or fury. True revenge was my existence, my survival, my success without him. I reached for a plate from the counter, set a small portion of food on it, and placed it in his trembling hands. Not out of love, not out of forgiveness, out of pity. A final act of mercy from a woman he once left to starve. "You can eat," I said, my tone sharp, decisive, "but you cannot stay." I turned to my daughters, their faces luminous with pride. They weren't the abandoned little girls he left behind. They were strong young women standing tall beside their mother. Amara's eyes burned with quiet fire, Naomi's with unshaken loyalty. They were the proof of my triumph, the legacy of my fight. I walked to the door, opened it wide, and gestured outward. Charles shuffled past me, clutching the plate like a beggar at a stranger's mercy. The night air swallowed him whole, his figure shrinking into the darkness until he was nothing more than a shadow. Then with a steady hand, I shut the door. Not gently, not angrily, but with the finality of a life reclaimed. I turned to my daughters and whispered, "We don't live in the past. We move forward." They wrapped their arms around me, And in that embrace, I felt the weight of every struggle lift. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the world alone. Together we stood in the glow of a future built on resilience, not betrayal. And as I held them close, I knew this truth with unshakable certainty. Charles had taken everything from me once, but in losing him, I had gained everything that truly mattered. Looking back now, I see the journey not as a story of abandonment, but as a story of rebirth. Charles walked out and left me with nothing but 2 little girls and a mountain of debt. He thought those words, "You'll figure it out," would break me. Instead, they became the fuel that carried me through every sleepless night, every humiliation, every tear shed in silence. I learned that strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like skipping meals so your children can eat, like walking miles to work with blistered feet, like holding your head high when the world whispers that you're finished. My daughters grew up not with a father, but with the knowledge that their mother refused to surrender. And today, when people speak the name Holloway, they don't think of the man who left us. They think of the woman who turned betrayal into triumph. So if you hear my story, I want you to remember this. Life doesn't end in the ashes. Sometimes it begins there. You can lose everything, your partner, your dignity, your home, and still rise stronger than before. Because in the end, it isn't about who walked away, it's about who stayed standing. And I'm still standing.